Hi guys, Michael from Varsity, and we are ready to present another topic analysis to you guys on the March NSTA topic, Resolved, the United States federal government should ban corporate acquisition of single-family residences. I will admit it first, with this topic, I was a little confused on whether or not it would actually allow for any nuanced argumentation beyond just a couple simple stock arguments on each side, and I believe that you're able to unlock all sorts of impacts with this topic, both from an affirmative and a negative standpoint. There's all sorts of things that you can talk about, and also a lot of really key historical context on the whole house purchasing market and all sorts of things that are really key to know on this topic before you go into your rounds. Now, with our current brief on the March 2026 topic, we are offering a limited time coupon deal where you're able to use a promo code LUCKYPREP26 in order to get 33% off of your purchase up until about March 8th. This will mean that you'll be able to get our brief for $19.99, a discounted price. So make sure that you're able to pick up that brief after you watch this video, and you can reference all the different things that we talk about to specific points in the evidence packet. Make sure that you pick that up today at www.varsitybriefs.com. Now, though, we have to look at a couple of reasons that this topic is very nuanced and what specifically this topic really is about. One of the things that you have to look at when you're evaluating the resolution, and specifically the wording of it, is the role of government. There's not really ever been a historical precedent where the government has come in and banned any sort of involvement in the economy from an entire class of individuals or companies. By banning corporations, this could possibly be something that is overreach and that the Supreme Court might not allow, or that Congress would not take kindly to, and they would be a body that is absolutely required to ever enact any sort of reform, because the president is not going to be able to ever enact any sort of wide or large scale sorts of reform solely on his own. Also, though, secondly, you have to look at the really tangible impacts of wealth inequality and whether or not they can or cannot be solved by any sort of solvency through the resolution, and whether or not banning corporations would actually lead to people having more money or being able to spend their money in a better way to advocate for themselves more or get the things that they need. And also, most importantly, whether or not a corporate ban would allow for people to buy these homes once they have to liquidate their assets, or whether or not these people will be permanently trapped out due to other types of discrimination or setbacks, etc. Also, though, there's another really key thing that you have to look at, and that's legal entities. That's a really important part of this topic that most people are not going to know a whole lot about, and how specifically the housing market is set up is that you can own a house in a couple of ways. You can own it as a married couple, you can own it on your own through a sole proprietorship, a trust, you can have a C Corp, you can have an S Corp. Also, though, you could have an LLC, a limited liability corporation. And there's all sorts of tax benefits and all sorts of loopholes that a person can exploit and also utilize based on whether you're on the AF or neg side, just by simply classifying what their house is owned under and the entity that they use in order to pay their taxes, own their house, and manage that asset. If you're able to know that, you're able to manipulate a lot of key arguments into moving your way with the judge, because if you know how the law works, you're able to explain it better and also most tangibly unlock all the impacts on this topic, something that your opponents will not be able to do unless they have the same knowledge. Also, though, most importantly, you have to look at the quality of life for everyday Americans with this resolution. Is anything actually going to get better for people, and will life get better for the average person as a result of corporations being taken out of the ballgame? Are people going to be able to access these homes? Is more construction going to lead to people getting the homes that they need, or construction costs coming down, etc.? You have to look at all sorts of things. But now that we have that out of the way, I'd like to move into some key arguments. Okay, now that we have that intro out of the way, I want to look at a couple of key things that on this specific topic we should be doing to be evaluating and weighing the debate. In any given debate, you have to have a clear advocacy for everything that you're talking about, and whether you're on the affirmative or negative side, it's going to be vastly different, especially on this topic, because it might be a little bit more different than usual. Firstly, when you get to the AF side of the debate, one of the things that you're going to talk about a lot whenever it talks about banning the acquisition of corporations from buying homes is specifically going to be an easing of the quality of life. So basically, what is this going to look like? Well, the entire thing that this resolution over here is trying to do is make it easier for the average American to buy a home, specifically by preventing these large, wealthy, and possibly greedy corporations from taking these homes and turning them into investment property when they should be a place where someone has a home, where someone lives, where someone actually enjoys and lives out their life. What possible quality of life increase are you going to have by making it easier for the average American to get a home by preventing it from becoming a simple investment? Though, on the negative side, something that you could talk about could potentially be the negative and adverse effects of that. So you could talk about how there could be a negative impact through government restriction. So basically, you're talking about on the neg that government control is negative. It could lead to people possibly being more discriminated against. It could lead to people being put in situations where race becomes a more harmful factor to them through things just like simple racism. And then also it could possibly boil down into something that is just as simple as like disaster recovery and what that gentrification could look like afterwards. So you talk about how banning corporations could actually lead to more adverse effects than anyone would actually have in the real world. But now that we have that out of the way, I want to look at a couple of key things on the affirmative side of this debate first, and then we will move into the neg. First, the one thing that I want to look at the most, and that is going to be the most important affirmative thing that you're going to talk about on this topic, is just going to be a simple reduction of the wealth gap. So the first thing you're going to talk about is going to be that wealth gap reduction. So what exactly is your advocacy going to look like on this? Well, fairly simple. First off, you're going to talk about the fact that basically right now, these corporate purchases are making sure that people are not actually living in these homes that own them, but rather just renters. Corporations aren't meant to have homes. You can find all sorts of quotes and stuff to back this up from all sorts of people across the political aisle, and this is actually something that could be fairly bipartisan. You have people like President Donald Trump, as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, possibly supporting policies that lead to this type of outcome here in the US. There's a ton of evidence in our brief that talks about the fact that when you actually look at making sure that families are getting these homes, that you could actually look at what is happening in the home market right now and find that these large corporate investors are increasingly buying these single-family homes specifically by taking them away from individual buyers. What does this look like? Well, they're going in with all cash bids, and a lot of these people who are possibly using a mortgage or a loan to buy a house simply are not able to compete with a large corporation coming in with $500,000 cash, for example, outbidding them by $50,000. And at the end of the day, you want guaranteed cash over a mortgage from a bank simply because more money today is always more valuable than more money later. And unfortunately, that's something that corporations are able to do very well, but most Americans simply will not. Also, there's some other evidence in our brief that talks about the fact that right now, like around 2024 and 2025, roughly about 13% of homes often that are sold lead to being bought by investment firms or any sort of investor, whether it's a small or large investor. A corporate portion of that is somewhat smaller. I believe it's something around like 3 to 5%, but still regardless, this is hundreds of thousands of homes because there's millions of homes in the United States. So any impact that you talk about as a judge to a judge has to be framed in the realm of, well, if this is something that could possibly even be beneficial to one person, is that an action worth taking? And that's something that you're gonna have to prove to your judge. Also though, another thing that you have to talk about is, and this is a subsection of this argument, is that in the United States, home equity is generally the largest asset that someone would have. So home equity directly leads to wealth. So home equity equals largest asset. So what is something that you can do with that little bit of knowledge? Well, a lot of home equity that people have is tied to all of the other things that they own in their life. For example, if you have your house paid off, or even if you don't have it paid off, you can get things like a second mortgage to finance buying a new car, send your kid to college. There's all sorts of things that you can do with the equity that is part of your home. If you have a $500,000 home, for example, which is somewhere close to the average of what the average home in the United States is, then that's going to generally be about the most expensive thing that any one person would have. Most people are not going to have a car or an object or a plane or anything that is going to be more valuable than that. So when a corporation comes and takes that away, what they're doing is they're harming the potential of Americans to build that home equity for themselves and allow them to actually move up in the real world. So another thing that you can find in our brief talks about the fact that for most Americans, you can find that this exact claim is roughly 50 to 70% of Americans. So this is a large impact that you can talk about to any judge. Also though, another thing that you can talk about is that there's also a much lower ownership rate for Black and Hispanic families whenever you look at these investment properties and where they're bought. Because generally they're often in cheaper neighborhoods that have not been invested into enough, that are gentrified and that are disadvantaged because of racial, institutionalized and racist reasons. So these huge corporations come in and they further disadvantage groups that have already been discriminated against in the United States. And you can tie all of that back into this. So I'm just gonna write racism here. And you could talk about the racial wealth gap. You could talk about the wealth gap just for all Americans in general. And overall, this argument is going to be the most important thing you could possibly talk about. Anyways, though, moving on, another key argument that you'll see on this topic is about fixing construction incentives. Just for a little bit of background, in the United States right now, if you actually look at a lot of the new construction we have for homes, which generally is not of the best quality, a lot of it is actually starting to be specifically for the purpose of renting for these large corporations. A lot of times what you saw back at the 1950s and 1960s era is that these huge producers of like homes would build out entire subdivisions, they'd sell out these homes, and then they'd be done. But now what these investors have realized is they can build those huge subdivisions and just rent them out to people for 30 years. They can make tons and tons more money than they ever would just selling it one time. So, fix construction incentive. And this argument might seem like a small one at first, but it's actually something that you can really tie down to the average person. One of the things that you can find is that right now in the United States, one of the reasons that Donald Trump actually signed an executive order specifically about this was actually to help stabilize building. One of the reasons that home prices are so high right now is because these corporations, their construction companies actually tend to push up the cost of construction because they have much bigger budgets. It pushes up the price of a median home. And so one of the goals of President Trump was to make sure that these prices come down. And this is not something that's just a Trump administration policy. This is something that Democrats want as well. So this is something that is widely recognized and also seen as a huge problem. Also, there's a lot of builders that we have evidence on this in the briefs, where when you actually look at a lot of the largest home building corporations in the United States who work a lot of times with these corporate acquisition groups, one of the things that they've talked about in interviews, like CEOs, CFOs, and CMOs, like chief management officers, they talk about the fact that policies like this from the Trump administration would lead to them having to completely revitalize their business strategy, having to lower prices astronomically just for the ability to still compete. Because people are still going to want to buy new homes. These companies still have to be able to provide new homes, otherwise tens of thousands of people will be out of work, construction workers won't know where to next go, and most importantly for these people, they don't want their company to fade away. Also though, another thing that you have to talk about is that right now, these new priced homes are about $15,000 more when they're built by a construction company. So there's a $15K surplus whenever you have a corporation involved. And so that is not a good thing. You do not want to have that here in the United States. And that's just at the bare minimum. When you look at individual states like California or New York, it could be astronomically more than Alabama, Mississippi, etc. Also though, one of the things that you have to talk about is that a lot of this entry-level home sale stuff, all of it leads to just long-term wealth inequality. So one of the things that you talk about is how this directly ties into the first argument. So these two would actually be really good to run in a contention together, maybe as a possible subpoint A and subpoint B type situation. But one thing that you could talk about is that if these homes are rented, these homes are not sold to the general public, it means that they try to lock you into a cycle where you don't ever own anything, meaning that you're paying a surplus that leads to a corporation making a huge profit on the place that you live, further widening that gap. That's something that is permanently locked into you, and if you're not able to get out of it because your rent is too high, most Americans spend generally about at least a third of their money from their paycheck on rent each month, then you're not going to have a good chance at gaining that home equity. There's evidence in the brief that talks about the fact that right now, 38% of total assets generally that people have to get spent towards housing every year. And so when you actually look at all the evidence, both from President Trump, from Congress, from people on both sides of the aisle, they talk about the fact that this is a bipartisan issue that people are willing to address. So on the affirmative, talk about the fact that these policies are very realistic, possibly happening, and are actually, to an extent, happening right now. Thirdly, though, this is another argument that I just thought of, and it's really important because one of the things that is most important about a home is that you take care of it. So this new argument is called civic stakeholder surge. And what exactly is this? Well, civic stakeholder surge basically is the theory that whenever you own something, you are willing to take care of it in a better way. Think of it like there's analogies that talk about the fact that generally when kids get older and they have to start paying for their own things once their parents aren't paying for their food, their clothes, their car, their home, etc., that they're willing to take better care of objects that they personally have a hand in, that they personally have skin in the game on. And it's the same concept with home ownership. Generally, you see a lot of people have to pay money like security deposits to these corporations because despite the fact that people, yes, are frankly getting ripped off by these corporations do actually have a large problem with people just not treating their properties very well. A lot of places require a $1,000, possibly even $2,000 security deposit to make sure that they're able to fix the things that people are not willing to take care of themselves, and that's because they have no incentive. It's not actually theirs. So civic stakeholder surge basically ties down everything to the argument that if people are able to have their own home equity, that they're more willing to take care of their home. And in turn, if you have neighborhoods where people as a whole are just owning the places that they live or working towards it with mortgages, that leads to a better neighborhood in general. There's a ton of evidence in the brief that we have from the Department of Housing and Urban Development that talks about the fact that institutional investors are increasingly buying these single-family homes, but that is actually directly leading to neighborhoods getting worse, not being invested in, having public blight, things that are very simple like an ungrown lawn or an unpainted house, rotting wood, just simple everyday things that add up and overall vastly decrease the quality of these houses monetarily. When these houses go on the market, simple things like that could lead to them being sold at tens of thousands of dollars less than that same exact neighborhood that is taken care of by private ownership. Also, you can talk about the fact that there's actually a ton of research from the US Census Bureau, and this is also in the brief, that talks about the fact that homeowners actually vote substantially more in local elections than renters when you look at the neighborhood breakdowns because of the fact that those policies directly impact their taxes far more. So you could talk about tax, you could talk about elections, you can talk about blight, and so this whole argument can be thrown out through a wide variety of impacts. And you can talk about how everyday life is substantially better for those neighborhoods that own their own home. And obviously this is something that is not a very easy thing to do here in the United States. A lot of people say now that the American dream is harder to get than ever before, and there are truths to that. But the thing is that at the end of the day, people who own their homes are going to be better off, and they're most importantly going to be more willing to take care of those things because they have skin in the game. And so we also have evidence talking about the fact that this could also lead to things like more school involvement, more tax revenue for schools, more people who are willing to work in their community, volunteer, etc. There's better local services, better childhood outcomes for things like education, lifetime earnings. On average, neighborhoods with private home ownership have children that end up being more prosperous throughout their life. And there's all sorts of impacts that you can tie down to every type of person. You can tie it to kids, adults, elderly, just anyone. And so this is a really important argument that at the end of the day has one key and specific impact. More improved ownership, more engaged ownership means that overall your quality of life is significantly easier. And that's what you talk about on the affirmative side. Okay, now moving on to neg, we're going to just look at a couple of arguments that you can use to most persuasively convince the judge to vote for you in any given round. First off, I just want to say this board is really smudgy, so I apologize, but I'll try my best to write as big as I can, and we'll work through everything. So the first important neg argument that you're going to use in any given round, there's this huge concept on this topic specifically about the legal entities that are used to actually purchase these homes by corporations, manage them, hold them, transfer them, etc. So there's a lot of problems with the way that the system is designed based on loopholes. And how exactly is this? Well, a lot of these loopholes can be used to have shell ownership. And basically what that means is it's a front company where the only thing that company is specifically doing is holding one specific asset in the name of another person or in the name of another company. So a lot of these people are using loophole shell ownership that own corporations to make sure that they're able to hold these houses, but in some sort of like private way to where they don't necessarily have to reveal who they are. So a corporate ban though would actually make sure that a lot of these investors are not able to use these loopholes anymore. One of the biggest ones that you have in the United States right now is called a limited liability corporation, or most commonly known as an LLC. and trusts. And a lot of these trusts and LLCs, they generally go together. And so sometimes an LLC can be contained within a trust, and its trust can basically manage the LLC through a trustee, but you don't necessarily have to disclose with any given LLC who owns it. So you can basically hide who owns anything. So private, not public. So an LLC does not have to disclose what the owner of it is. They just have to have some sort of trust or other entity listed that manages it, meaning that any sort of person or any sort of jurisdiction like a local city would have to go to court and basically ensue in a legal battle in order to crack open that LLC and figure out who owns it. And what exactly does this do? Well, LLCs make up the majority of home purchases from these corporations. And so a lot of these corporations, around 3.2% of homes that were sold in 2024, went to a corporation specifically through an LLC. So it's actually a pretty substantial impact here in the United States. And this is something that is probably going to continue to grow over the next couple of years. And you'll find all that evidence here in our brief. Also though, one of the things that you can talk about is that a lot of these shell entities overall, they just conceal the true owners. So enforcement is not really possible and they're not able to actually find out who the buyers are. So if you're selling a home, for example, and you don't really know who you're selling it to, the only thing that you know is whether or not you're accepting an offer for $500,000 to buy your house or $550,000 to buy your house. And as we talked about previously, sometimes you can talk about the fact that you could possibly have a corporation that comes in, pays more cash than any homeowner possibly could all at one time rather than a mortgage. And so basically what happens is that people are locked out of the home market specifically because they don't know who they're selling to. They're just taking a gamble on whether or not this is actually going to a real person. And so basically what is happening right now is that laws are used to exploit these weak regulations in order to make sure that people are able to hide through layers of protection legally and that regulators aren't really able to figure out how to solve it. And so there's just a lot of really opaque standards that come to these corporate structures. And so all these offshore buyers that possibly could be in New York but buying homes in Atlanta or just like in Los Angeles when they had the Pacific Palisades fire, a lot of this is hidden from public data and you're not able to find it, crack it, or whatever without having to go to court for months and crack open that individual trust. A lot of these anonymous shell companies are generally hiding their owners by just nestling all sorts of different properties through different jurisdictions and distributing everything that they purchase. And also a lot of these homes, specifically when they're bought by a corporation, have an LLC for every single trust. So LLC times 1 per home. So for example, let's say that you sell 1 million houses in the United States. If you take 3.2% of that million, all of that is just for LLCs, for corporations. 3.2% of the population is held under an individual LLC entity for every single one of those million homes. That's something that's not okay because it means that you can't just crack open a trust and figure out whether or not corporation Y owns 50 homes or 500 homes. No, you have to crack open hundreds, possibly thousands, or possibly even tens of thousands of LLCs, and you don't necessarily know if they're going to be owned by the same people. There's no way to realistically enforce this ban because of the way that the law is set up right now. Also though, secondly, you have to talk about the fact that there's a possibility that this type of resolution could actually increase discrimination from what we see right now. So I'm going to write that down real quick. And at first, it would seem really counterintuitive because you could talk about the fact that oh, well, if these organizations are not buying homes, then obviously it's easier for people in disadvantaged communities to purchase a home. Well, not necessarily. Because a federal ban on corporate acquisitions could actually shift ownership towards a lot of smaller landlords, meaning that the problem could get even worse. It's just going to be spread out a lot more among people who have significantly less money. So a lot of mom and pop investors already buy a lot of growing homes in a lot of areas, and they actually make up a significantly larger percentage than all of those corporate investors. These mom and pop investors could possibly own up to 20 homes before they're considered a medium-sized investor. And to be a large investor, I believe the Department of Housing and Urban Development says that you have to have at least 100 homes. So you could be a mom and pop investor and have dozens of houses, and that could actually mean that in a world where something like this happens and these corporations are forced to liquidate their assets, a ton of mom and pops are either going to pop up or expand and take over all of these homes. And so why specifically would this be more discriminatory? Well, that's because a lot of individual people are going to be more discriminated against, or more discriminatory than a corporation that could possibly either be publicly traded or wants to keep a high corporate reputation. There's a lot of issues, obviously, in the United States with people who are racist, xenophobic, people who are discriminatory. And when you have basically a situation where individuals are retaining ownership of homes on their own individual level, they don't have to report to anyone. They can hide everything through a trust. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that really holds them back from using discriminatory practices when choosing a new tenant for their house, when they're choosing who to actually sell a house to, and also, more importantly, how they're treating that individual throughout the process. Whether or not they're giving them the respect that they deserve when something like a white family and a black family try to buy the same exact home for the same price, etc. Background checks, all sorts of things could possibly be used in a racist way, and there's all sorts of evidence about that in the brief under our discrimination sections. Also though, most importantly, building off of that, a lot of these smaller landlords don't really have a lot of fair housing training or any sort of compliance system. So there was a piece of evidence that we had in this brief that talked about the fact that 73% of discrimination for housing occurred at all of these mom and pop units rather than these corporations, meaning that it's a significantly larger scale when you actually look at the people being harmed. And also, a lot of these large corporations require a lot of training for their employees on fair housing practices because they don't want to get sued. They don't want to have any claims that they're going to have to settle in court. And while that might not be the right incentive, that is something that is true in the status quo. And so a lot of these large portfolios use a standardized screening algorithm, which yes, can be discriminatory, but when you really just leave everything up to the human bias of the individual investor, the individual owner of that home, that's going to be significantly worse than a computer system that you can at least attempt to fix. So basically this informal screening, it's not going to leave a really big paper trail, and it's not going to allow these people to file a claim where they could say that their rights were violated, because a lot of these small mom and pop landlords, they're not using these systems, they're just using their judgment. There's not going to be a paper trail. There's nothing that people are going to be able to use to get the justice they deserve if they're put into a bad situation. And so these large operators, right now in the United States, they're just so much easier to audit. They're so much easier to correct, test, and make sure that they're doing the right thing, because you have things like the Fair Housing Authority, you have the Department of Housing and Urban Development, you have all sorts of organizations and oversight organizations in the United States, both on the federal and state level, that make sure that at the bare minimum, these corporations are at least doing something to be fair. And so one of the things that's super important is that a lot of this discrimination is going to block housing access. Meaning that if you're a black family, a Hispanic family, or possibly even right now an immigrant family here in the United States, you could be blocked off in a way that is significantly more harmful than it would be in a world without policies like this. Okay, now moving into that third argument though, there's something really big on the neg that you could talk about, and you could actually relate it a lot to natural disasters and recent events. So thirdly, we can get to something called disaster recovery. And what exactly is this? So basically what it is right now on the neg side, we could see that there's a really important argument where you could talk about the fact where if corporations are banned from buying these homes, then you could actually be banning cash buyers from purchasing these storm damaged homes. And so at first this seems like a really good thing. But what actually happens is a lot of the time, this means that these homes are going to be put in a decrepit state and remain so for a really long time. Because these institutional buyers use a lot faster renovation methods. They're willing to sink a lot more capital into these neighborhoods that get totally destroyed. And in the end, these institutional buyers use a lot of financing to have major repairs after a lot of areas are torn down, destroyed, etc. When you look at areas that have been suffered as a result of Hurricane Katrina, or fires in California around the Pacific Palisades, or all sorts of tornadoes in the United States and more, a lot of these companies are able to come in and use discounted renovation practices and renovate things really quick and efficiently because they have the relationships necessary to actually get the people into the place, to fix the place, sell the place, get it back on the market, etc. And while that house might not go back to private ownership, it is at least going back to a state where it is able to house someone, period, and that's really important. And so without these buyers, a lot of these damaged properties are probably going to sit vacant a lot longer, which means that there's not going to be a lot of re-occupancy. So basically, no investors equals no fix. And so that's one of the things that you have to talk about. And you have to really balance this out, because at the end of the day, you have to talk about the fact when you're weighing that there is a negative result of government control. So you have to specifically tie the fact that the US government wants to ban corporate acquisition of these homes to permanently destroy neighborhoods that will never get rebuilt. Areas that are never going to have people again, because there's not going to be people who are willing to put in the capital necessary to fix them. And so there's a lot of evidence in our brief that talks about this, and one of the things that you can talk about is that when you had things like the Pacific Palisades, a lot of those wildfire recoveries had a lot of debris removal and permits and occupancy approvals, and a lot of times this can actually take years, but due to the relationships that a lot of these corporations have with state regulators and state officials, they're able to streamline all of the things necessary because they're able to prove compliance, capability, the ability to do things safely, etc. And so a lot of times what they're able to do is they're able to get all these permits a lot faster than an individual contractor because they do it so often. They're so used to it. When you do things over and over and you do it a lot more, you're generally going to be able to do it more and more efficiently each time. And that's just a small segment of why you actually want these corporations, because also you could talk about the fact that a lot of these slower repairs mean that a lot of displaced families are not going to be able to go to either their homes or the area where they're from anytime soon. If you look at the Hawaii fires just a couple of years ago, I can't remember which island it was, but there was a ton of families who were displaced, like hundreds of families, and were not able to actually live on that island anymore because their home had been destroyed. They had to move to other islands in Hawaii, they had to move to California, Alaska, or other places in the United States or elsewhere because their home was not able to be rebuilt by them because they didn't have the funds to do it. And also in Hawaii, because of strict regulations, there weren't really a ton of investors that came in. So you can have real and concrete impacts that show just a small example of what a policy like this can do. It can lead to people being forced out of their homes because they really don't have any realistic alternative. They can't buy a new home in the same place, they can't fix up their old property, and they're basically just permanently trapped. And so as a result of this, it's really important that you're able to tie this, most specifically, to just overall fixing. So you have to talk about fix homes, but also, just even on a broader scale, you have to talk about the fact that a lot of these homes, they're just communities. Because when there's a fire or a natural disaster, there isn't just one home that's affected, there's entire neighborhoods and subdivisions that have possibly been there for decades. And so by pushing out all these people and not actually giving them a realistic alternative of fixing those homes when they don't have anything to do themselves, the only thing that you're doing is leaving them blind, and you're not able to do anything that is able to possibly help them, especially when things like FEMA and the federal government are really not able to give that much assistance other than some bottled water and a little bit of food. Okay, now that we've gone over both sides though, I want to specifically look over how exactly you're going to best attack the side that you're trying to go against. So if you're on the neg, how are you going to attack the AF, and then vice versa. So first off, let's look at how specifically you can try to take down some of the AF arguments that I presented you just a little bit ago. So one of the big things that you can use with the wealth gap is that generally there's not really a whole lot of uniqueness when it comes to the wealth gap in this topic specifically. You can talk about the fact that, like, by and large, most homes are generally still bought by an individual. Like, corporations are in no way the main, only, or like largest driver of the wealth gap here in the United States when it comes to homes. And so a lot of times investors represent like a very small minority. And so in the end, investors, small. And that's in comparison to the whole country. Like, obviously there's still like a lot of them. There's a lot of big ones, but they're not necessarily a large percentage of the overall population. And so you can talk about the fact that when you have things like the racial wealth gap, other things that I talked about when I was bringing up the wealth gap overall, that this is something that existed long before we had home ownership. Like, it has been something that has existed in the United States for well over 100 years. Home ownership in no way has really affected racism or any sort of institutional racism, discrimination, previous laws that have held back minority communities. And so it's not really something that as a whole can really relate to corporations, and if anything could actually just tie back to the government. So you could try to bring that up as well. Also though, the gap that you have right now between like the top 1% and then like the bottom 50%, for example, is generally just driven by things like income inequality or credit access, zoning restrictions for homes, a lot of educational disparities between neighborhoods and their school districts and how much money they sink into their property taxes, which then goes to the schools. And then also just decades of historical discrimination. When you had things like redlining back in like the 1950s as of most recently, redlining left a permanent impact that you can't really get rid of with the wealth gap simply by just addressing one very small thing. Also though, you can talk about the fact that if you're actually reducing the buyers, which that's just getting rid of these big corporations, the only thing you're really doing is you're actually like suppressing the home values and doing the exact opposite of what you want to do. I mean, obviously, as I talked about, home equity is like the largest single source of wealth for most Americans, like 50 to 70% of them. And so if you're just removing an entire class of buyers, the large corporate buyers, the only thing that you're doing is reducing demand. And when you reduce demand, you're going to slow the appreciation of those houses, and overall you're going to weaken home values, meaning that a lot of people are going to have less money. Their mortgage could possibly be at risk, their second mortgage, because if what you took your home at is not the same price that you're currently financing at, and that house continuously just goes down over time, you're not really in a good situation when you need more money, when you need to get more money or more assets out of your house. Also, it sinks you into a situation to where if you want to sell your house, you're in a really bad position. Also, home ownership gaps, they're driven a lot of times by things just like credit, which I talked about, but just to expand on that, a lot of like low home ownership rates when it comes to credit specifically happen in Black and Hispanic communities, and it all comes down to income disparity because a lot of times they're not able to get the education necessary to get enough income for them to support themselves. And this is something that you can tie back to all sorts of discriminatory laws, and there's tons of evidence in our brief that talks about this. But even if there were more homes available, there's a lot of households that are not really going to be able to afford to buy them. This affordability barrier is something that permanently locks them out. It's not the people buying them, it's just simply the amount of money that they would cost, and they don't have that money. So the only thing that would happen is these corporations would be forced to liquidate their homes, and there's no one that could really buy them except for those small mom and pop investors that I talked about, which could possibly actually make things worse. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. Anyways though, secondly, there's this whole argument about construction incentives and how you could possibly fix them. But that isn't necessarily true simply through corporations, because there isn't really a lot of uniqueness to builders just saying like, oh, we have to totally change our business strategy based off of a couple interviews, because obviously they're just going to respond to profits reports and whether or not they're making any profit at all. So a lot of these developers build based off of like the agreements that they make, contracts that are not going to change, and things that like are guaranteed to happen. Local demand that they have already contracted out, have set in stone, and probably are going to continue to have, just in separate places or maybe on a smaller scale. Whether that buyer is a corporation or a household or some wealthy person who wants to build out a new condo neighborhood, builders are still going to respond to the amount of money that they're going to spend on land and materials and labor, all of which are very high in the status quo and have only continued to go up. Things like zoning restrictions continuously have made houses more expensive. And so there's a lot of things that make houses significantly more expensive today than 50 years ago, and has nothing to do with corporations, but regulations. And so there's a big difference on whether or not you can just blame these corporations or whether there's like a multifaceted problem. And so this shortage of entry-level housing is not something that you can just address by changing the people who are building them. And so investor demand isn't really going to change a whole ton of that. And so also, a lot of times these construction people, these companies, they don't really distort construction because a lot of these large buyers provide these generated purchases that I talked about during economic downturns. So even when the 2008 crash happened, there's still examples of companies that were still building houses at a record pace because they had these contracts like a decade in advance. Like these are things that happen over a long period of time. They're well planned out, etc. And so this is able to stabilize the production like when people need these houses. And this is something that isn't really like oh, I want houses, they're going to start being built in 6 months. No, there's a lot of time and effort that goes into this, and so it's really just not that simple. Overall though, if a world does exist where these construction people have less homes because there's building that goes down, the only thing that happens is that prices are going to get higher, housing becomes more affordable because there's less of it. Supply and demand is going to actually hurt the American people, and that's not something that you want. Also though, thirdly, there's this whole argument that we talked about earlier about civic stakeholder surge, and specifically taking this one down is a little interesting, but there's not really a clear link between corporate ownership and civic collapse. You can't really just say that a lot of the problems in our communities can be linked back to the fact that a corporation owns a home or a neighborhood. You really have to rely on a lot of evidence that isn't necessarily as well tested out as some other things that we have in our brief. And just the fact that homeowners vote more than renters, that's true, but another thing that you could talk about is generally those homeowners are older, and the more old that you are, the more likely you are to vote. For example, if you're a renter and you're 25 years old, or you're a college student like me, a lot of college students don't vote, a lot of 25-year-olds don't vote, and that's just because they don't really think it's that important, whereas homeowners, they really do because of things like tax breaks, like capital gains taxes that they can use when they sell and buy their homes because they're older and that's more important to them, and they are just more into a point of their life where things like that are significantly more important. And so a lot of these renters, though, they also just can't qualify for mortgages, and they prefer to have that mobility. Like, there are people out there who genuinely prefer to live with rent. And so what are the benefits of this? Well, this means that people don't have maintenance costs. It means that a lot of times they don't really have to have insurance on the apartment that they live in. They don't have to mow their grass or other things like that. And so this whole thing about civic engagement, you could really paint as very overstated, because you can always just go back to the phrase, correlation does not equal causation. And so while homeowners are going to vote more, it's not because of the fact that corporations are not present in their lives and that they own their own homes. Could simply be due to age, things like that, just things that are very simple. And so a lot of things like income could also drive a lot of these homeowners to vote as well. But generally, you could tie that income back to them being homeowners who are older, because generally people who are more established in their lives are going to make more money. So there's just all sorts of things you could talk about. Also, you really have to talk about the fact that just because you're a renter doesn't mean you're inactive. Renters are not inactive. Some of the people in our communities today, like young people here in the United States that are in their 20s and 30s, are some of the most politically active people that we have. It obviously depends on which community you're in, but they engage a lot in protests and community organizing, voting, all sorts of things, and just participating in school boards or local elections, things like that. And so you don't really want to just have a world where the affirmative just treats renters like they're basically these people who aren't willing to engage or help their community. So just be sure that you're trying to combat those stereotypes basically in any type of debate. Also though, when it comes to answering the neg on the loopholes argument, you can't really say that you can't really say that there's going to be a law that would pass that would invalidate well over 100 years of any sort of entity law without either a replacement or a contingency plan. And this is really important. And so plan necessary. And so this is something that would have to go through the United States Congress. And obviously, as we know, Congress takes a really long time to get things through, but that's because they like to be slow and methodical and make sure that they actually want to have a plan instead of just getting rid of something totally. For example, the reason that when a couple of years ago, when President Trump wanted to revoke Obamacare, that it failed was because Republicans were willing to vote against that repealing because they didn't know what was going to happen as a result after that. John McCain was famous for throwing his thumb down because he didn't know what would replace Obamacare, and it's better to have something that might not work necessarily too well than nothing at all in total chaos. And so to say that this would happen where Congress would throw us into a situation where our entity law is totally screwed up, corporations are banned, things like LLCs are possibly revisited or voided or things like that, it would throw the economy into so much chaos that it would make 2008 look like a dwarfed crisis that was basically nothing. Whatever happened as a result of this would be like the Grand Canyon compared to a crack. This is not going to happen. It's not realistic. It's something that Congress would never do. And so you can't just say that this bump in the road would happen, because no, it would be like a Grand Canyon. It would be horrible. And you can find all sorts of stuff that talks about the fact that Congress is willing to prefer bad solutions over terrible ones. That's just common sense. And so the idea that a corporate ban would also push more people into using LLCs is also kind of inaccurate, because that's already the status quo. And even if it wasn't the status quo, there's all sorts of other entities you could use. You could use an S Corp, a C Corp, though a lot of people don't use those because you can't have capital gains tax benefits with those. You could have a sole proprietorship, you could have a trust, a corporate, a company, and overall it's just really non-unique, and so nothing's really going to change from the status quo simply because it is not realistic. So, not realistic in any other world. And so you really have to just boil everything down to that. Moving on to discrimination though, this is just not a unique argument. That's plain and simple what this really comes down to, because you can actually find that these corporations, they could perpetuate racism significantly more because of the programs that they use. Some of these algorithmic programs that they use for screening and tenant decisions, the racism or possibly any sort of negative discriminatory impact could be so ingrained into those systems that they aren't really able to notice it, they're not able to measure it, and they're not able to say whether or not they have a problem because they might not even be able to realize it. There's a fault and problem in the computer system. And so sometimes there's things that are so deeply ingrained into our technology that we're not even aware of the fact that there is a true issue. And so to a degree also though, you can argue to a judge that at the end of the day, racism is something that is institutionalized in the United States, and it's something that we are not really able to do like any solvency through this resolution with, because of the fact that you can't just have one thing that's going to undo generations of discrimination or trauma, like a true wealth gap because people were not able to have as high earnings, etc. And so I also just read this thing the other day, specifically when I was researching this topic, where actually a lot of African-American families actually try to use LLCs and all of these other sorts of corporations specifically to shield who they are when they're buying a home. And so a lot of Black and Hispanics use LLC for protection. And I thought this was a really unique argument because one of the things that we talked about on the other side was that there is a problem where Black families or Hispanic families go when they're trying to buy a house, and a private seller could possibly be racist to them and discriminatory, but if you're using this LLC for your protection, you don't know who you're selling that house to. And sure, there is a problem with that. Obviously, it's good to know who you're selling to, but in a world where we have like true issues, it's better to not know who you're selling to than have a situation where people are possibly being harmed in some sort of discriminatory way. And so if you actually get rid of these loopholes, you could possibly make discrimination even worse because you're taking away a tool that Black and Hispanic families use in the status quo to protect themselves. And so one of the things that you're able to do is find evidence on this. I'm sure you can find some cards on this. I think we might have a little bit of stuff about this in our brief, but really look into that discrimination argument and how specifically to combat it, and also run it on the other side. Just know it all around because it's something that's going to be really important on this topic. Thirdly and finally though, I also want to look at disaster recovery. This is the last thing that we're going to look at on this topic analysis, but when Annette talks about the fact that we need corporations to rebuild these destroyed areas, it isn't something that really is necessarily true. First off, when homes are destroyed, insurance companies, they have to give families the amount that the home is worth. In the United States, if you have a mortgage, you're required to have home insurance. And that's just common sense because a bank is not willing to give out a loan, a mortgage, any sort of money to a person who is not able to insure the money that is given to them from that bank, because if something happens, the bank is never going to be able to recoup that investment. And so something like 70% of homes in the United States right now are under an active mortgage from a bank or a private equity firm or something like that. And so at the start, you have at least 70% of homes that are insured because 70% are under an active mortgage. That's something that you have here in the United States. But when you also look at those 30% who are mortgage free, a lot of time this is elderly people who have paid off their house after what is a typical 30-year mortgage, the elderly. But a lot of these people, they still choose to have home insurance, and that's simply for their protection. Because a lot of these elderly people, if they were ever able to lose their home, they're not going to be able to go back into the workforce and get money and be able to put themselves in a situation where they're able to get a new place of residence. It's cheaper for them to pay thousands of dollars in insurance a year to protect their home than it is for them to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in a possible accident. So when you actually look at this whole disaster recovery thing, at the start, 70% non-unique. This is something that's virtually irrelevant because of the fact that those people are protected. They don't need those corporations to fix something that they will be able to get money to fix themselves. 30% have a free mortgage. They don't have anything that they currently owe on that house. A lot of these elderly people already have this home insurance which protects them. But even when you look at the people who don't have that home insurance in the status quo, those are people that are still protected with one key thing. You could talk about the fact that possibly they could sell it to other people. You are able to sell your land to other people who might have money from a previous accident elsewhere, who might just generally want to move into that area. And overall, if you sell land, people are going to probably buy it eventually, especially if it's in a destroyed area, because there was a demonstrated interest in that area having growth beforehand, meaning that the people will be interested. And these people, despite losing their homes, could be able to sell that land, recoup a portion of what they lost, and find something that they can do in order to get a new residence for themselves. Obviously, it's not a perfect world, but it's something that's better than a corporation, and we don't necessarily need a corporation to come in and fix anything. When we were talking about the Hawaii fires, this is something that happened in Hawaii. Some of these people were able to be insured, they were able to fix their situation, etc., but they didn't necessarily require any sort of corporation to help them. And so corporations, in the end, are not necessary to fix these natural disasters because sometimes housing is more expensive as a result afterwards. And so if you keep these corporations out, these people are able to rebuild their homes. And those who aren't are able to probably get at least a solid portion of their money back, and most importantly, be better off because they will find something that they can truly own rather than something that a corporation will keep them liable for until the end of time.